Hi, MC Thomas here, and I'm going to be talking about the big week that Marvel has had. This is probably the biggest news that we've seen in Marvel movies, probably in a few years. I mean, we've all heard about the Doctor Doom news. We've heard about Deadpool and Wolverine already making over $400 million at the box office just this weekend. It's the biggest R-rated movie opening of all time. And just like how Deadpool teamed up with a friend, Wolverine, that's what I'm doing today. I have my friend Brandon here. He is my resident X-Men expert. I know some about the franchise, but he knows the comics, he knows the shows, he knows everything. So how you doing today, Brandon?
Oh, I'm awesome. It's great to be here. First time ever doing something like this, so it's great to be a part of it and experience it. And yeah, just bringing in love for the comics and the franchise of X-Men in general. I was first introduced to it with the 93 series of X-Men, the animated, with having a few of my dad's comics from when he was little, from back in the 60s and 70s. So just kind of piecing all that together and enjoying this fanboy ride over the last, 20, 25 years now. So yeah, happy to be here for it.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for joining. Yeah, and a big part of Deadpool and Wolverine, obviously, there's a lot of crossover with the X-Men. There was a lot of characters that we saw. Now, first of all, I should say we are going to be spoiling everything in Deadpool and Wolverine. So that's your spoiler warning. If you haven't seen it yet, just know that we're going to be talking about all the cameos, everything in detail. But as far as X-Men goes, I know there's a lot with Wolverine, obviously, but also stuff like we saw Channing Tatum is kind of a comic version of Gambit, just poking fun at the rumors that he was going to be in it. We saw Professor X's evil twin, Cassandra Nova. I know you had some issues with her. I don't really know much about her character, but I know you kind of had issues with her as the villain. But how do you think about just overall how the X-Men were portrayed in this movie?
I mean, there was a lot of it that really good throwback moments and visions of what new universe and iterations of the X-Men could be. But a lot of the issues that I've had with Phase 4 and 5 of the MCU is still the overall character development and building of the story. It's just the assuming that we're just going to take whatever's thrown at us. Now, what does work about, I think, the X-Men in Deadpool is that it goes right on par for the pacing, the humor. The Deadpool movie was exactly what you expect out of a Deadpool movie. It had some crude language, it had all the appropriate jokes, and just the chemistry between Deadpool and Wolverine was just absolutely incredible. So those were really high points and everything that, just to speak to the movie. But as far as setting up the introduction of the X-Men, it's still one of those that it could go any way at this point.
Yeah, and one of the many cameos that we saw, we talked about, they had Henry Cavill showed up briefly as a variant of Wolverine, which, was mainly meant for humor. He was like, hey, we'll treat you way better than DC does. But that is one of the things that got us thinking. We've seen the classic X-Men actors come into the MCU, like Patrick Stewart in Multiverse of Madness, or Multiverse of Sadness, as I like to call it. We saw Kelsey Grammer come back as Beast briefly in the Marvels. And now we have Hugh Jackman back as Wolverine. But one of the things we talked about is if they did want to do a serious reboot of the X-Men in the MCU, what that would look like. I think, kind of a more serious take on it. But what are your thoughts on that?
Well, definitely where they've set up to go forward between the Marvels, also everything from, Black Panther, Wakanda Forever. They're very much setting up the mutants in there. Now it's going to be interesting how they actually integrated, whether we just accept what mutants are and how they were brought into the scene, or whether they take the time to explain their actual place in the MCU and how they've kind of been behind the scenes. That'll be interesting, but as an overall, I guess, franchise reboot, I would just kind of like them to come in with a whole new fresh take, with Multiverse of Madness and the TVA through the Loki series, and them really expanding upon, the timeline, the universes, and especially a very heavy take on the void, what's at the end of time. I think just a fresh take on doing a very, not necessarily comic accurate, depending on when you came into the X-Men, because you're now talking decades worth of material and universes and story arcs to go by. But to me, I really think I would just like to see a whole reboot of what it is. They've definitely paid homage, and Deadpool and Wolverine to all the Fox 20th century iterations of it. And, to me, when those first came out, and I believe Kevin Feige was only assistant on one of the X-Men movies, it was great for that time. But I think that with the MCU, and especially for the first three phases, we can see what they can really do when they put time into the story and character development. And I would like to see the X-Men have their due at that as well.
Absolutely, I agree with all of that. And you were mentioning kind of mutants that they were already introducing into the MCU. I know Namor was one of them from Wakanda Forever. Miss Marvel, they hinted that she was a mutant as well, even played the little X-Men theme jingle in that show. But I know that, like you said, being a full reboot, I think might be better for the franchise, because I know that X-Men was something that they had written back during the Civil Rights Movement, and X-Men was very much meant to be an allegory for, discrimination, for prejudice. Whereas, the MCU right now is a world where superpowered beings are already widely accepted and loved. Whereas I think, with the MCU being all about multiverse now, I think that you could have a universe where mutants aren't accepted, and where, they do, because I feel like that's a big theme of X-Men. Would you agree with that? That, they could probably do something like that?
Oh, and I think after things that, I feel like for maybe the past 20, 30 years as a society, we thought that we've definitely got past as far as issues of sexism, racism, and thought that we had gotten to maybe a slightly more developed and accepting point within our society. And clearly, what we've seen is that there's been some very serious undertones of hate and discrimination that, I think this actually makes a perfect time for all this to resurface. And I think that if you really dive into the history of how the X-Men started with Stan Lee and the original creators of the characters and the story arches, that, this, I feel like the MCU as a whole, when you think of it as Avengers, really goes in to talk about just like the grandeur and just how the world is yours, and all these different characters and stuff. But they're not really coming from a place of discrimination. They have hardship, it's part of the character development, but those speak a little more universally, that any person anywhere can experience some of those hardships. Whereas the X-Men really speak to that minute demographic within our society, the ones that are forgotten, the underdogs. And that's really where they made their way on the scene, is that in the early 90s, you had such a generational shift that they made their place from being a group of outcasts that really fought for acceptance. And so you're building on a lot of peaceful, especially the idealism that the character Professor Xavier brings in, is that Martin Luther view of peaceful protest and to stand your ground. And so
when Magneto was kind of like the Malcolm X of that time, so you've got two characters fighting for the same thing, it's just they're going about it in very different ways.
Yeah, and it also speaks to very different upbringings and just where the characters, I mean, really that was part of where the X-Men started. While you originally had your core group that started in there was a huge movement of these additional characters, and especially with like Storm, who was by far one of the first and most popular, not only female comic characters, but African American characters, who has absolutely stood the test of time, who has fought for both pacifism and standing up for what you feel is right, but also about fighting to hang on to what makes you unique, that don't apologize for that. And that speaks past the color of your skin. That speaks past of where your birthright. That is just understanding who you are and being proud of that. And so I think these are undertones that whatever the next version of the X-Men are, I feel like that they need to really lean into that. So
yeah, and I think that there's a lot of possibilities, kind of shifting to the next two Avengers movies, because I know, we were just going to do a video on Deadpool and Wolverine, and then they dropped the news last night that Robert Downey Jr. is going to be playing Doctor Doom in 2026. It's going to be called Avengers Doomsday, and then 2027 Avengers Secret Wars, which, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I never read the Secret Wars comics, but I know that it's something where you've got a character who's, God Emperor Doom, I think they call him, and he just has this planet or this area where a bunch of the heroes just come together and fight. And I think that when you've got the Thunderbolts, you've got, X-Men characters, you've got Avengers, you've got Young Avengers, all these different groups that can, kind of come together. And I feel like, Secret Wars might be the end of the MCU as we know it, giving them an opportunity to sort of reboot the whole thing after that. But yeah, the Robert Downey Jr. announcement is really interesting because a lot of people, and I agree with this, a lot of people are immediately saying he's going to be an evil variant of Tony Stark. Is that kind of what you're thinking too?
I feel like they can really go several different directions. I just worry that Marvel and Kevin Feige has really just leaned into that the success of the MCU was on the actor Robert Downey Jr. alone, and that's not to take away from, just how much he was Tony Stark and Iron Man, but it just feels like kind of a cheap move at this point too, instead of building something new and grandeur. But then again, if they execute it in the right way, it may be the next step that we need to transition into, the upcoming phases. So it's going to be really interesting to see the take that they go with.
Yeah, and I think the fact that they're bringing the Russo brothers back too, because I know there was different director names they had tossed around, and then all of a sudden they're like, okay, which directors made us the most money? It was the Russo brothers for Infinity War and Endgame. So like, well, why not? If it ain't broke, don't fix it. So I think that's the mentality they're taking there. And honestly, you see, with Deadpool and Wolverine, going back to that, I mean, the opening sequence is Deadpool literally desecrating Logan's grave, saying, hey, we're doing this for money, and they kind of wink at the camera and acknowledge it. But I mean, you see, the money they've made this weekend, it works. And so if bringing back old actors and directors that people love, if that's what makes them money, that's what they're going to do. So I am a little concerned that it'll, at the effect that it might have on Tony Stark's legacy as kind of the hero who died at the end of Endgame. But we'll see. Maybe they surprise us. Maybe there's a good reason that they're bringing him back, or maybe there's a good explanation for it, or maybe they just make him a completely different character, but he's so unrecognizable that we don't even think about Tony Stark. I know, everybody saw him in Oppenheimer. He very much transformed himself for that movie, to the point where I forgot at times that he was being played by Robert Downey Jr. That's how much he really got into his character, I thought.
Oh no, again, that the comments that I made before were nothing to speak to Robert Downey Jr.'s ability to just absolutely take ownership of the character of Tony Stark. But the first thing I thought of after the initial shock of did they really decide to go this route was, the reference of, you live long enough to see your hero become a villain.
That's right. That's right. Harvey Dent, right?
Yep. And so I kind of wonder where they're really going to go with this. And like I said, I really feel that it's going to be a pivotal point, that either this is the make or break potentially of the MCU, and also lays the groundwork for how good of a chance they give to X-Men, because this can really be a make or break for that franchise. We've seen what happens when you have really good character development and then you bring it all together after building a very good story arc and storyline and just pouring into character development, because you have to care about the characters that are in those big movies to be able to pull off multiple cameos and multiple storylines that all converge at once. And I'm just afraid they're going to rush it. And to me, that can be very detrimental to where the future of all this goes.
Yeah, and that's what'll be interesting about Secret Wars. I had a video that I made months ago where I jokingly just kind of suggested, well, hey, what if they just bring back, Tobey Maguire again, and bring back Robert Downey Jr. as Tony Stark? And it turns out they are bringing him back. So I wonder, if they bring him back as Doom, could he also come back as a variant of Tony Stark, I wonder?
And that's a very good possibility. I believe that's where majority of the fan base is really questioning, is that the move they're going to make? And it certainly seems with the announcement, everything from the green outfit with the metal chains. Seems very heavily suggested that may be where they go with that. Yeah,
so my hope for the MCU, I would say, because, I absolutely love the Infinity Saga. Everything from the original Iron Man up through Endgame I thought was just brilliant. And since then, they've had a couple good films and shows here and there, but since then it just seems like the MCU has gotten so bloated, and they've set up so many little things. They're setting up the Young Avengers. I know Multiverse of Madness had kind of a cliffhanger ending that didn't really go anywhere. Eternals had a cliffhanger ending that wasn't really going anywhere. So my hope is that they can take Secret Wars, just make that the definitive end of the MCU as we know it. And then, like we were talking about earlier, maybe just start from scratch again. Make an entirely new X-Men franchise, make an entirely, even just, doing certain things over. But it is kind of fun to think about. One thing I always like to do is fan casting. So if you did have to, put some current day actors in as some of the X-Men characters, who do you think might be good in those roles?
Well, I think that question actually brings into a good point to kind of tie it back to Deadpool and Wolverine, is that they very clearly played into with, again, spoiler, Gambit's character being played by Channing Tatum, which was a long anticipated, awaited, and then very much trashed movie. And in my opinion, I think it probably was for the best. I was not a fan of Channing Tatum's character, but it did bring me into question as far as who would have been better for that character. And it very much was a fan cast to have him do that. So for me, it left to question who. And of course I went to the internet to see where some of the fan favorites, and roughly there was about 20 to 30 relatively good suggestions, with a very strong fan base still saying give Channing Tatum his due. But some of the more interesting ones that, could probably gain my support, again, you have to understand the character and the heritage and just where he comes from as a person, instead of just somebody who deals cards, as far as that very New Orleans, swamp rat, Guild of Thieves history that he brings to the table. Not to mention a fan favorite love interest of his is Rogues, that you've got to have a character that can pull a woman like that and keep her interested. So some of the more interesting ones that I thought was Travis Fimmel, who is known for his role in Vikings as Ragnar Lothbrok.
Okay, nice.
Matt Bomer, which I know him most well from White Collar, and then in Sommerhalder, I know I'm going to butcher that name, who I know him from is from Lost, but I think also was a part of Vampire Diaries. So those were some very interesting, everything from their looks, their acting career, to just their potential to embody that character. Again, I don't think that you necessarily need to spend money on a name to get a quality actor to embody the character. So
yeah, and that's the thing, as long as because Hugh Jackman wasn't unknown when he first played Wolverine, and I mean that's kind of the role that rocketed him to superstardom. So it's like, yeah, I agree with you. You don't necessarily have to find big name actors to play, because I know, again, Henry Cavill's Wolverine was kind of played for a joke. It would be cool, but also I think it would, there's plenty of, young, capable actors you could bring in and kind of make it their start. But yeah, so no, thanks very much for coming on today. I think we had a great discussion. One more question I have for you. Madam Web 2, is it going to happen?
I know for your answer, just for more screen time with Sydney Sweeney, that yes, but
more Sydney Sweeney is always a good thing.
But for viewers' actual entertainment and quality, I'm going to say I hope it doesn't happen.
Oh yeah, I think Sony. It's funny. Sony does so well with stuff like the Spider-Verse movies, and like No Way Home was fantastic. But when it comes to Morbius, Madam Web, the Venom movies are okay, but I'm just like they just need to stop all that. But yeah, no, thanks again for chatting about that, and thank you all for watching. And now tell me before we go, I'll put the link in the description. But I know you're really into art. You've got some great art portfolios and work. Do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, just so kind of a quick shout out for there. You can find me on Instagram and Facebook under Brandon Donahue Art. Would love a like and a follow if you can. I don't really, over the last little bit of expanding our family and stuff, that haven't really been putting the time I would like to into it. But as we're figuring this this life out with a child that hope to get back to it and would love to like and follow and support. So yeah, and again, thank you for having me on here today.
Yeah, anytime. And thank you all for watching and listening. I'll also post the links in the description to my novel series, A Warrior Still and A Warrior Betrayed. If you enjoy the Jack Reacher series or any kind of action thriller like that, I think these will be for you. So thanks again for watching, and I hope you all have a good one.